thanks very much for that introduction.
Thank you.
All right, so the purpose of this session is to have a discussion between Paul and I, and then to extend it out to everybody in the room to as great an extent as we can. So we're kind of maintaining that kind of downward trend in formality that we've had kind of all morning. And we're going to explore some of the connections between the emergent open source community, I suppose emergent is perhaps the wrong word at this point in history, but certainly how that connects in with the emergent open research or open science community. Many of you will be familiar with the recent ebook that was put out by John Maxwell, in which he and his co-authors explored the open source publishing landscape, talking about such projects as OJS, the Cocoa and Libero project and Phenom, PubPub, Jupyter Notebooks, Editoria, those sorts of things. And so when Paul and I met, it's worth discussing that a little bit. I was doing, as part of a research project with a group of funders called Knowledge Exchange, a series of interviews around the subject of open research and the way in which people, not just researchers, but also research managers, data managers, and various other types of stakeholders, and also commercial companies like Digirati, all contribute to the concept of open research. During the course of that discussion that Paul and I had, and some subsequent discussions afterwards, it struck us how much there was a strong parallel between the sorts of discussions that are going on within open science and open source, and also the kinds of skills that people develop and the kinds of problems that people are trying to solve, and some of the types of solutions that are being developed. Thinking particularly around challenges around interoperability, around collaboration, and around the sharing of things like, for example, standards, code bases, data, so on and so forth. So, without going into too much detail, Paul, what I'd like to do is to give you first a sense, an opportunity to talk a little bit about Digirati, and talk a little bit about the kinds of open source projects that you guys have been involved with, and then we'll take the conversation forward from there.
Okay, thank you, Phil. So Digirati are a primarily services company and consultancy and services company, but we have been working over a number of years developing open source products alongside the project work that we do. Now, I guess our history has involved proprietary software for many, many years, and we continue to work with it. But over that, certainly over the last 15 years, I think the trend towards the use of, and I guess as we saw in some of the talks earlier, Paul's talk about the kind of, I guess, the prevalence of open source software that's underpinning a lot of the systems that are running some of the biggest businesses around the world, that trend has kind of continued. And for us, that has given us the opportunity, I guess, to work more closely with communities, and in doing that, develop not just projects, but products that can then support the wider community. So I guess some of the areas that we've worked in includes some of the cultural heritage cultural heritage sector, where we work with everything from libraries and archives and museums. And in that, we have developed a variety of different open source products. So one, for example, is Universal Viewer, which was originally conceived as a way of unlocking images, digital images, so providing a standard way for accessing these on the web. Now, when we originally started on that, one of the big problems was interoperability, or lack of interoperability between systems. So a lot of organizations who wanted to, say, present the digital artifacts for a particular project or subject area that they were working with, every time they'd done that, it was something new. And it was moving with the technology, or the flavors of the technology, and there was no standards between those. So that project emerged into a product, and that's continued to grow, and I think there's about 150 institutes around the world that are using that at the moment. As you mentioned, we've some of the open source projects and ecosystem development that's happening in scholarly publishing. We have worked with Eli over a number of years. We've helped in collaboration with the Vero platform development, working with Coco and Hindawi and others in trying to help develop the components that underpin that. And we've also done work in the research data management domain, so working with universities, helping them in how they're managing the deposit of research, making that data more findable, accessible, and so on. So just, I guess, open source is a big part of that now, and that's continuing to develop and grow, and I guess help with the openness that you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the topic of the kind of the parallels between open research, one of the things that often comes up in conversations about open research is this idea that simply putting something up on the web, is not going to make it findable, is not going to make it reusable, is not going to make it discoverable for people. So there's more to it than just putting something out there. You have to provide metadata, you have to build a community around it. So a lot of publishers in the audience will be, familiar with the discussions around the fact that what they're doing is, basically assisting a community in its communication. So does that translate over to open source? Particularly, I noticed in reference to John Maxwell's ebook again, they, very interestingly, didn't include a particular company, Overleaf, in their analysis, because they said that while Overleaf's source code was publicly available, there wasn't a community of development around it. So there's this almost another definition of open source, that it's not just about putting your code on the table, but it's also about, again, that community building so that you've got actually a conversation forming.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that, obviously, as we said, open source has been around a long time, and I think certainly as software and the engineering practices have evolved, the ability to kind of build and manage the community and manage the interaction that's necessary to help support and develop the software, the solutions themselves, that has changed, and I think that it's the ability now to develop a community or a network and have them positively contribute and be in a position to shape. And it's not about software development. I think that's it's a key thing to consider. It's about sharing use cases and the use for a system. So perhaps, the rationale for excluding that is that if there's not seen to be that kind of interaction with the wider community, the opportunity to kind of shape and influence, then there is a danger, much like with, I guess, more closed or proprietary systems, that you don't have the opportunity to kind of take more ownership of that and see that as a long-term viable solution for you, perhaps.
Yeah. So I suppose that one of the things that some people might be thinking, perhaps in the audience or perhaps in the publishing community, is, if I look at just putting my code out there, surely what I'm doing is just giving away my intellectual property. Surely all I'm doing is just letting other people know, what my, that I'm just lowering the bar, and I'm reducing those barriers to entry that I've worked so hard to put all this effort and all this work into. But the flip side of that is this kind of community of contributors to a project, to some code, right? So can you give us kind of examples of cases where that's been a really strong benefit, where the perceived risk of giving away your code is outweighed by the strength that's brought by having that community involvement?
Well, I think I suppose the nature and the types of open source software has kind of evolved in terms of what kinds are made available. And, over many years, a lot of that was kind of lower level, so more infrastructure related and so on. And maybe the reason for that is obviously the ability to do business or to improve how you're doing business. So that those kind of foundational blocks form a lot of the part of maybe the original areas of sharing open source. I suppose the point about it, the development of that and taking that forward, as an organization, you have got your own view of what it is you need to do. And I think what we're kind of seeing and have seen over the last number of years is that obviously the areas where everybody's doing broadly the same thing, so if we take things like databases or search, those are effectively components that can be provided as a service. So as an organization, if you're doing something which is fairly standard and maybe lots of other people are doing but in slightly different ways, then there's value in coming together and sharing that. Because really, if everybody needs to do that, is there really benefit to be gained from that being proposed? I think the value that you get from others contributing to that is what makes that stronger. I think, an example for, I think, again, Paul talked a little bit about Microsoft as an example. I mean, Kubernetes, which is containerization orchestration software, has gained fairly rapid adoption over the last 5 years since that came out. Now, when you look at the range of organizations who are actually utilizing that, and they range from Microsoft, Google themselves, Amazon, and lots of big organizations, the value that they're getting from that, the benefit of actually coming together and having this standard way of doing that part of the chain of delivery, if you like, the benefit is so great that it makes sense for them to come together and do that.
So do you think there's also a sense of the feedback mechanism that's inherent in that is very valuable? So if I think of the amount of feedback that people get when they move in an open science direction and publish preprints, for example, many of the researchers that I speak to say that it's one of the most valuable things about that is that they get to send their article out to lots of different collaborators within the community. They get to send it to all of their colleagues, they get to get lots of early feedback, and then by the time it goes to a journal, it's in much better shape than it would ordinarily have been, and so it's more readily and easily accessible now, or accepted. High energy physics and economics, for example, have been doing this for a very long time, but it's slowly starting to kind of move into other areas, particularly around biology with bioRxiv and other projects like that. So do you think that there is a parallel there as well? Do you think that there is a way that it increases the quality of the work that people do?
Absolutely. I think kind of going back to in our own history as a company, I think one of the things that a lot of developers, myself included, I guess one of the things that you found frustrating or can be frustrating working with those sort of systems is that there's no feedback loop. So if you're working with a system and you've got problems with the system and you're trying to work those out, you're doing that, within your own space, really. I think the advantage of working in the open, and I think particularly what's maybe changed is that over the last 7 or 8 or maybe 9 years, as things like Git workflow, for example, so the approach of actually committing, getting review comments and feedback on your code, that process, because that's, I guess it's become more and more common. There's more kind of a de facto standard way of doing that. People are using tools that make that really easy and open, so GitHub and GitLab, for example. Because that's so easily accessible for people to actually participate in the review process, get involved in the process, people are really willing to do that. And I think as a developer, the opportunity to get feedback from your peers is really valuable, and obviously it helps you develop, but it also, from a kudos perspective, it's nice to kind of do that. So I think absolutely that is, and there's definitely parallels with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's that kind of feedback kind of mechanism is very strong, and it does remind me of the sorts of things that's happened around kind of editorial workflows, where there's a strong argument to be made that OJS, for example, helped people regularize editorial workflows publishers, and that has reduced cost and increased kind of transferability and interoperability of a lot of systems. So there's a scale to this, isn't there? That when we're all doing something that's similar sort of thing, sharing processes, sharing standards, sharing code and sharing data enables us to all work in a much more efficient sort of fashion.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess one of the challenges that has maybe affected some of the earlier software that was released in that way. Obviously, OJS has been around for a long time and has, been really valuable in that sense. But I guess maybe what's changed again is the ability to kind of build more modular components and make those more readily available. So actually, it's more about building, an ecosystem of building blocks that you can use to assemble a solution. So rather than trying to package up an entire solution, if you provide the building blocks, those common building blocks that do the things that all of these systems actually need to do, and bringing those together, that maybe with improved processes and technology, it's easier to sustain those in the longer term. So if you've got components that just do a certain thing, then obviously contributing and improving that obviously benefits those that are using it. But you're not, you've still got more flexibility if you wanted to change some part of that process without maybe upsetting and changing your entire system. So I think how technology and software development has moved forward, and how the prevalence of cloud services and the ability to kind of work with those has made things like microservices and so on much more common. I think that enables the open source software to come together in ways that maybe it was more difficult when it was more monolithic, if you like. And I think that provides the opportunity to kind of build on and work with that more. I mentioned search, for example, earlier, and for a lot of systems using things like Elasticsearch is just is accepted because it's a really good search tool. And for a lot of organizations, that's a piece of open source software that they're potentially using, and there's not necessarily a reason to potentially change that. Now, you may change that over time, but if you've got the ability to use those services and join those services together, then it certainly improves the ability to invest in, and I guess be comfortable that strategically you've got something that's there for the longer term. So I think that's certainly a positive.
Yeah. Some people might be thinking, how can we as a publisher, maybe a small publisher, how can we possibly do this sort of thing, right? Because the traditional view is either we can buy into a large platform, or we can partner with a large commercial publisher, or on the other hand, we can make our own thing. And even if we have these open source components, we're still going to need, IT operations. We're still going to have to be able to deploy this and customize it. So that's just way out of our capabilities. And is there a way in which some of these newer models can help smaller companies make use of this infrastructure?
Yes, I think there is. I think coming to that point a little bit, the community side is really the key to this. It's about the awareness of what's there and what can be used. And I think for smaller publishers who maybe don't have a technology team, that should not preclude them, because I think the key thing is actually joining that community and bringing their use cases to it, which furthers the definition of what that platform, what that ecosystem can become. So their use cases are important for that. And I think, obviously, the idea with developing these components in an ecosystem that can be used in that way, the idea is really to think about a sustainable model, because you will have lead organizations who will work on maybe producing some of that, but getting the input from other organizations just from their use cases, for example, and then allowing and providing the kind of open landscape to allow service providers to then potentially provide that service. Now, that service could be a hosted service which utilizes technology, but obviously as a publisher, you've still got more ownership of that, in the sense that the underlying technology itself is open, and therefore you can easily change service providers if you wish to do that. But also service providers are there to kind of, I guess, help add some of maybe the missing elements that aren't in the software itself to help kind of suit your use case. So as they do that, that then benefits others, and I think that's kind of the key thing. So if you are engaging with that, you're moving things forward, and I think that's That's really important. I mean, I think, you know, I think in the case of Libero that eLife are working on, I mean, I think that is, you know, it's been through a number of iterations, and certainly the way that they're looking at it, alongside the work that Coco have been doing, is really to try and promote that community side, to really help people understand that it's about coming together and sharing the burden for developing things that are standard, but then being able to kind of, as a community, build those things that other people need.
It's very much early doors on this, isn't it? Because there aren't that many projects which are really making use of what is this new kind of emergent mechanism for developing infrastructure, is there? So I think that we're probably going to see more people coming into that space as service providers. We're probably going to see more, not just forks perhaps of the Coco project, but other projects perhaps spinning up and creating alternatives in that kind of landscape. So perhaps there is an emergent third way between buy and build that we expect to see growing in the next few years. All right, so I think that's... Oh, you have a question? There is time for a question. Put your hand up more forcefully. Yeah.
Sorry, I do that. So I work in strategy, and I'm interested in the role of strategy in this area, because obviously big open source community projects take on a life of their own, as they can have a... Oh, thanks.
They can have... Hello. Did anyone hear the beginning of what I was saying? Great. Excellent. Got a sufficiently loud voice. So I'm interested in the role of strategy in this area. A large open source community project has a kind of grassroots or bottom-up approach sometimes, and there are differing degrees to which there are top-down approaches. There's an intersection here clearly of like strategy, culture, and technology. And I think the fact that we don't have all of those three pieces in place in scholarly publishing is why we're not seeing some of the changes that would benefit everyone. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that, and also, do you think there are things that could be done that would be compelling to bring over people who don't want to let go of their platform strategy, who have cultural issues, who could move the needle here? Because otherwise I think some of these fringe, that they'll stay more minority and the big players won't get involved, and like game-changing things won't happen. So I'm interested in your thoughts on how we can...
I think you're definitely right, there's a cultural piece there, right? Because there's in the same way that, you know, open access is kind of pushing us away from this idea of this is our content that we own, that we then sell or license out. It's moving us into a situation where content is going to be free and money is to be made from providing services and various features on top of that, top end, right? And that's exactly the same sort of parallel, is that there's a culture shift away from viewing my code as my intellectual property to we're going to collaborate on a code stack and then we're going to, you know, layer on services in order to really add our value in that direction. And that is definitely a cool... I mean, do you see evidence of that culture shifting anytime soon, or is there more that we can do?
I think there's more that we can do, because I do think, I mean, I think thinking about the strategy side of it, I mean, I think what's happening more now with some of these open source projects is that the consideration for how organizations interact with it, the governance of it, how it's going to be steered and so on. There are more models now available that people can kind of follow, so it's less maybe scattered than perhaps it once was. And I think that maybe gives organizations more confidence about what they might actually get from their engagement in that. I mean, I think in terms of, you know, what would move the needle forward, I mean, I think this kind of comes back to some of what we were talking during Tasha's session. I mean, if, for example, you were obviously there's standards, lots of standards out there that underpin, scholarly publishing, but it's maybe the applicability of that and actually the ease at which, you know, if someone did submit an article and that article was rejected by a particular publisher, and how that could then just maybe flow. So that kind of underlying infrastructure may be something that potentially could be more game-changing if you could see the potential for taking away some of the researcher's pain by actually making the process of submission much more straightforward and much more, this is a standard approach that you can do and take. And if the technology that underpins that, so the user experience around that, is a lot more user-centered and considers how the researcher needs to work, then perhaps that's one way of really getting more people on board with it.
All right. We've got another hand up, but are we out of time at this point? All right, let's keep going.
Okay, just very quickly, there's some great questions there. It's a brilliant session. And I think almost certainly everyone's problem has been solved by someone somewhere in open source. And the great thing today is we're standing on the shoulders of giants. There are publishers of all kinds. Netflix is even a publisher. LinkedIn is a publisher of your own content in some way, re-churning it out for you. And if you look at something like the New York Times, WordPress, it's WordPress. It's incredible. So I've got a small community site. I could have built it myself. I did it in WordPress, but it scales all the way up. And then you've got things like Markdown language, changing the way that we work and allowing us to publish in different ways. So I think it's a bit of time and research, but nearly all our problems have been solved in some way. The community's out there to ask those questions and to help you.
Absolutely. So there's more benefit to be gained from bringing information in, that we shouldn't be so scared about clinging on to the information that we already have.
Yeah.
Are we going to? Are you going to call time? Are we going to? I think we've probably overrun a little bit, haven't we?
You mentioned the connection also with open access.
Yes.
And obviously, it's very tempting to see that connection, also because the very prominent examples of open access, open source developments. Now I'm getting confused myself. Are publishers that are fully open access. And e-only. There are publishers, imagine it or not, that still publish print and that even have still paywalls. Now, a provocative question: is it ethical to have paywalls on an open source built platform?
Is it ethical to have paywalls on an open source built platform? You're asking me to kind of make a judgment on that. I mean, what do you think, Paul? Are you gonna call it? I don't necessarily think there's a.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer whether it's ethical or not.
But Ian thinks he can.
So there's really, I think it's not a complete overlap, but it's nice to look at the analogies between open access licensing and open source licensing. And although it's not a complete analogy, in both cases, they broadly break into two buckets: restrictive licensing and permissive licensing. When it comes to open source, permissive licensing is represented by things like the MIT license, which is essentially, I make this available to you, the world, don't blame me, have fun, knock your socks off. If you want to make some money on it, or a company, go ahead. Restrictive licensing and open source are things like the Affero GPL license, which is, this is a religious text, you may not modify it, and if you even look at this, you must make sure that everything you do in your life is open. There are similar equivalents in open access licenses. Permissive or CC BY, we just require accreditation because that is the scholarly norm, but beyond this you may do anything you wish with it, including wrapping this up in a book that you sell for whatever you wish to do. And then permissive restrictive licensing is more like CC BY NCND. And I think I prefer to push people towards permissive licensing on both sides, but there isn't an either or implicit direct moral obligation to look at the world in one way. These are merely artifacts of how we can interact with these forms of information. And then it is our duty of care, in a way, to look at that landscape and figure out how do we create sustainable models that provide value to the scholarly ecosystem, in particular the research. We're trying to work through all of the problems that we heard earlier about. So that would be my view on it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good, solid answer. I mean, to me, the question was, is there a moral thing? And I think the answer is kind of no, not really, right? It's just the same way that there's no moral problem with using publicly funded roads in order to have a delivery service that you charge people money for. You know, people do layer on services and charge money for free infrastructure, essentially. So, yeah, there's a legal answer and a moral answer. All right, thank you very much. Thank you.